11 million people would witness a slow-burning psychological nightmare. They would watch familiar television talking heads succumb to a murderous entity, and they would be told that their own televisions were acting as conduits for this demonic force, and they would believe it. By the time the television broadcast cut to black, the BBC's telephone switchboards were blowing up, slammed by an estimated 1 million calls from a hysterical public. A pregnant woman went into premature labor from the stress. The broadcast was fictional. It was a scripted drama that bypassed the critical thinking of the entire United Kingdom. The blueprint for the mass hysteria began in the mind of screenwriter Stephen Volk. Volk was a specialist in the macabre, having already made a name for himself by writing the script for Ken Russell's 1986 film Gothic. Volk had an idea for a supernatural television series. He pitched a 6-part drama to the BBC that would follow a fictional television crew and a psychic investigator as they traveled the country exploring haunted houses. The executives at the BBC didn't know what to do. They didn't understand how the format could work or why viewers would watch 6 weeks of a fake documentary. But a BBC producer named Ruth Baumgarten saw untapped potential in the idea, eventually convincing the network to let Volk retool the concept into a single 90-minute special. Volk came up with the idea that would create the project's infamy. He decided to structure the script as if it were a factual, live outside broadcast unfolding in real time. At the time, the format was reserved for serious news magazines, and applying it to a horror story was completely unheard of. He thought that when people watch paranormal investigations, a dark part of their psyche desperately wants to see a ghost, even though that they know that it's impossible. Volk wanted to give them that wish, and then punish the audience for having that wish. But a brilliant script is only so much. To fool a nation, the BBC needed to weaponize their public trust, and they were about to get the perfect people for this job. In the early 1990s, the concept of reality television didn't exist. The found footage horror genre was about 7 years away from being popularized by the Blair Witch Project. When Volk was drafting the script, he used the names of real-life British television personalities as placeholders. He never actually believed the BBC would allow its most trusted broadcasters to participate in a horror film. But to his shock, the network recruited a powerhouse cast of household names to play themselves. Parkinson anchored the show. He was the ultimate voice of reason, the skeptical, no-nonsense journalist that viewers trusted to sniff out a hoax. Sarah Greene provided emotional leverage because she was a comforting daily presence to millions of British children, and putting her in physical danger felt wrong. Mike Smith increased attention to a breaking point. Because he was married to Greene in real life, his on-screen panic over her safety carried an unnerving weight that a fictional marriage couldn't replicate. And Craig Charles was brought in as the jovial, slightly cynical humor that viewers expected from a live event crowd reporter. To direct the special, the BBC hired Leslie Manning. Leslie Manning was a filmmaker who immediately recognized the success of Ghostwatch relied almost entirely on achieving hyperrealism. If the broadcast looked like a traditional, polished BBC movie, the audience would figure it out right away. The Screen One drama department shot their films on high-quality 16mm film stock. Manning fought against this, demanding that the entire project be shot on standard, lower-grade television videotape. She said that the visual texture of videotape was the subconscious language of live television news. And after a bitter dispute, Manning won, making sure that it looked like a factual news report. Manning created the production to simulate the chaotic, clumsy environment of a live broadcast. Instead of using a traditional film crew, she used a multi-camera television studio setup, using actual BBC technicians rather than actors to operate the equipment on screen. The camera operators stalking through the haunted house were genuine BBC cameramen, instructed to capture the action with the unpolished urgency of a breaking news team. The BBC actively invited the audience into the story. Throughout the broadcast, viewers were repeatedly encouraged by Mike Smith to call in with their own ghost stories. The BBC assumed there would be a mild public reaction and set up a pre-recorded message on the line explaining that the show was a fictional drama. It was a safety net that was designed to catch anyone who might be taking the broadcast a little too seriously. But the safety net would break. The scheduling of the broadcast was the first issue. Ghostwatch aired directly after the evening news. There was nothing to indicate that the program was fiction. The BBC did broadcast a brief Screen One logo with an opening title card that credited the show as written by Stephen Volk, but these were only on the screen for a couple seconds. If a viewer blinked or walked into the room a minute late, they were instantly plunged into what appeared to be a deadly serious journalistic show. Parkinson opened the show, setting a grounded tone. The target of the investigation was a modest, ordinary house on the fictional Foxhill Drive in Northolt, Greater London, and the setting was inspired by the infamous Einfeld poltergeist case of the late 1970s. It gave it a grim working-class reality that felt close to home for the average British viewer. Inside the house lived Pamela Early and her two young daughters, Suzanne and Kim. For 10 months, the family claimed to be terrorized by a violent poltergeist. The entity announced its presence by violently banging on the home's plumbing. The children gave the ghost the moniker Pipes. Volk's script was key. Traditional horror films rely on establishing tension quickly, but Volk deliberately made the first 45 minutes of Ghostwatch incredibly slow and mostly uneventful. Viewers watched Sarah Greene awkwardly interview the exhausted family while Craig Charles bantered with rowdy teenagers on the street outside. In the studio, Parkinson debated the psychological validity of poltergeists with Dr. Lynn Pascoe, who was a parapsychologist whose intense, desperate belief clashed with Parkinson's dismissive, journalistic tone. This realism worked. Maybe it worked a little bit too well, by forcing the audience to sit through the mundane logistics of a live outside broadcast. And it even had dead air. The program completely dismantled the audience's guard. But beneath the surface, a nightmare was building. The audience was being hunted, and they didn't even know it. Director Leslie Manning hid the ghost in plain sight, using the visual degradation of videotape to obscure its terrifying presence. Pipes was portrayed by actor Keith Ferrari. He was heavily made up to look like a bruised bald man in a black Victorian dress, with one eye completely missing and his face covered in deep bloody scratches. And Ferrari was never doing jump scares. He hid in reflections and shadows for seconds. The production manipulated the audience's perception, creating a terrifying Easter egg hunt that amplified the horror. The studio host would play footage and viewers at home would spot something in the background. But when the host rewound the tape to check, the entity was gone. Across the 90 minutes, the ghost made several verified blink-and-you-miss-it appearances. During the playback of bedroom footage, a white standing outline of a figure was visible behind the curtains. When Parkinson's rewound the tape on air, the figure would vanish. Parkinson would claim he couldn't see anything. When Craig Charles was interviewing a paranormal exorcist on the street, the mutilated face of Pipes is visible standing motionless in the crowd of everyday onlookers. These subtle appearances preyed on the audience's sanity because the sightings were never acknowledged by the hosts. Viewers sitting in their living rooms felt they were seeing a monster that the people on screen were ignoring. And just as the tension reached a boiling point, the story used a massive red herring to cement the illusion of journalistic reality. Midway through the broadcast, the hidden infrared cameras caught the eldest daughter banging on a metal bed frame to simulate the poltergeist. Parkinson immediately declared the entire haunting a desperate hoax orchestrated by a troubled family looking for attention. For a moment, the audience breathed a sigh of relief. The tension dissipated. It was just a disturbed teenager acting out. And then the true horror was unleashed. Suzanne suddenly fell into a violent, unexplainable trance. Deep, bloody scratch marks spontaneously appeared across her face in real time. When she finally spoke, the voice of a young girl was repeatedly placed by a booming, unearthly, guttural roar. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. Mike Smith reported that the switchboard was being flooded with calls, but the nature of the calls was changing. Viewers were no longer reporting sightings of Pipes on the screens. They were calling in a state of panic to say that their own clocks were stopping. Their glass tables were shattering, and there were strange, violent banging noises echoing across their homes. In a moment of realization, Dr. Pascoe stared at the camera and delivered the script's most devastating blow. She realized that by broadcasting the investigation into millions of homes, the BBC had inadvertently linked the consciousness of the entire country. The live television program was acting as a massive nationwide séance, feeding the entity unimaginable power and allowing it to travel through the broadcast symbol directly into the living rooms of viewers. The climax descended into chaos. In the house, the possessed Susan vanished behind a locked door. A frantic Sarah Greene abandoned her journalistic composure and rushed to the pitch-black cupboard to save the girl. As the crew entered the door, a mirror shattered, wounding the cameraman. Greene screamed in the dark and was violently dragged into the void. The door slammed shut, and the live feed from the house cut to violent, shrieking static. The entity's power transferred to the BBC studio. A ghostly wind howled through the soundstage, ripping papers from desks. The heavy lighting grids overhead began to explode, showering spikes onto the fleeing crew. Mike Smith screamed for his wife's safety, demanding to know where she was before fleeing the set in terror. Alone in the dark, lit only by flickering emergency lighting, Michael Parkinson wandered aimlessly. The man who had represented safety and reason for the British public was utterly broken. Staring blankly into the surviving camera, Parkinson's face twitched. Opening his mouth, he began to recite a children's nursery rhyme, but the voice that came out of him was a deep, demonic growl. The screen faded to black. The BBC logo appeared, and the broadcast was over. But for the BBC, the nightmare was just beginning. As the credits rolled, the public was completely terrified. Desperate for reassurance, or that it was all a prank, viewers scrambled to their telephones, dialing the number that had been plastered across their screen for the last 90 minutes. The BBC had anticipated calls, and they believed their safety net was secure, but the sheer volumes of calls overwhelmed their telephones. The system jammed entirely. The pre-recorded safety message explaining the broadcast was fiction didn't work. Instead of hearing a reassuring voice explaining the hoax, terrified callers were met with a busy signal. In the minds of the panicked public, this busy signal confirmed their fears. The BBC was under attack. The studio was destroyed. The presenters were dead, and the emergency was entirely real. In the actual BBC studio, the reality was different. Stephen Volk, Leslie Manning, and producer Ruth Bumgarten had attended a cast and crew watch party, drinking and celebrating what they believed was a highly successful piece of drama. But moments after the broadcast ended, Bumgarten arrived at the gathering. Her face was completely pale. She looked at Volk and delivered the news. We've jammed the switchboard at the BBC. The fallout was brutal. The BBC announcer who followed the broadcast introduced the next program, Match of the Day, without offering any disclaimer to the traumatized audience. It was a bit of a mistake. The next morning, the British tabloid press erupted. Front pages were dominated by the scandal, accusing the BBC of betraying the public trust. Viewers were deeply, furiously frightened and offended that a public broadcaster had manipulated them into feeling vulnerable in their own homes. The anger was palpable. On the BBC's own viewer feedback show, Bite Back, angered parents launched into aggressive tirades against the producers, accusing them of traumatizing children and acting with irresponsibility. One irate woman wrote to the producers demanding financial compensation so she could purchase a new pair of trousers for her husband, as he had literally soiled the ones he was wearing in terror. Sarah Greene recognized the damage to her young fan base, and she was forced to make immediate appearances on children's television programs that Sunday to prove to the youth of Britain that she was alive and well. But the outrage over broken trust and soiled trousers was overshadowed by medical consequences that would change television history forever. Ghostwatch achieved a dark milestone. It became the first television program ever cited in a major medical journal for inducing clinical post-traumatic stress disorder in its audience. 18 months after the broadcast, the prestigious British Medical Journal published a report authored by two doctors, Simons and Silveria, from the child psychiatry unit at the Golson Hospital in Coventry. The report detailed the clinical cases of two 10-year-old boys who had been referred to the psychiatric unit suffering from severe psychological distress linked to the Halloween broadcast. The boys exhibited harrowing symptoms, including sleep disturbances, fear of the dark, separation anxiety, panic attacks, depression, and severe irritability. The trauma was so much that one of the boys reported to be violently banging his own head against the wall in a desperate attempt to dislodge the intrusive thoughts of pipes from his mind. The authors of the report were clear in their diagnosis, stating the trauma in our two cases had been caused by the television program the boys had watched. They noted the unprecedented nature of the diagnosis, writing that post-traumatic stress disorder due to watching a television program has not been reported previously. And publicizing this report opened floodgates. The following month, the letter section of the BMJ was inundated with letters from psychiatrists at various hospitals across the UK outlining similar cases. The medical community began debating the findings. But the psychological trauma inflicted upon children paled in comparison to the tragic consequences that would unfold in Nottingham. 5 days after Ghostwatch aired, the horrifying reality of the broadcast culminated in the death of 18-year-old Martin Denham. Martin Denham was a teenager with learning disabilities and a mental age of approximately 13. He lived with his mother, April, and his stepfather in a home in Bestwood Park, Nottingham. The Denham family home suffered from a defective central heating system, which caused the pipes within the walls to creak, groan, and bang loudly throughout the day and night. On Halloween night, Martin sat down to watch Ghostwatch, the fictional narrative that had a ghost named Pipes, the entity that communicated by banging on the central heating of the system of the house. According to his stepfather, Martin became hypnotized by the broadcast. Following the broadcast, Martin's behavior shifted. He was a naturally nervous boy who already had fears of ghosts, but he became completely obsessed by what he had witnessed. That night, for the first time in his life, he insisted on sleeping with his bedroom light turned on. Over the next few days, he became increasingly paranoid and terrified at noises echoing from the pipes in his own room, convinced that the demonic entity from the television had used the nationwide séance to take up residence in his walls. On November 5th, 1992, the psychological burden was too much for the teenager to bear. Martin Denham would unalive himself in a local park near his home. The Denham family was shattered, and their grief quickly crystallized into anger directed at the BBC. The BBC issued a carefully worded statement through their solicitor expressing deep sympathy for the Denham family, while asserting that the program had been clearly advertised as fiction. The regulatory bodies of the United Kingdom were not willing to let the BBC escape accountability. Driven by the complaints of the Denham family and dozens of other traumatized viewers, a judicial review compelled the Broadcasting Standards Commission to formally investigate the program and the BBC's conduct. In 1995, the BSC delivered an unprecedented verdict. The commission ruled that the BBC had been grossly negligent, stating firmly that the network had a duty to do more than simply hint at the deception it was practicing on its audience. The commission condemned the program for being excessively distressing and graphic, airing too soon after 9 p.m., and concluded that in Ghostwatch there was an attempt to cultivate a sense of menace. The ruling was a blow to the BBC. The network was forced to issue a formal apology to the public. Faced with this bad press, the medical reports of traumatized children, and the tragic death of Martin Denham, the BBC opted to erase the experiment from their history. Ghostwatch was banned. The BBC locked the master tapes in their vault and refused to repeat the broadcast on British television ever again. It became the ultimate forbidden media, a piece of lost television lore whispered about in playgrounds and early internet forums. Its terrifying reputation growing in the shadows. It would not be until 2002 that the British Film Institute was permitted to release a 10th anniversary edition of the film on VHS and DVD, finally allowing a new generation to revisit the nightmare that had traumatized so many people. Today, Ghostwatch is recognized as a controversial scandal, but also as a groundbreaking visionary work of horror that altered the trajectory of modern media. Stephen Volk and Leslie Manning laid the architecture for an entirely new genre of movies by using consumer-grade aesthetics, found footage mechanics, thermal imaging, and being dedicated to absolute realism. Ghostwatch predated the phenomenon of the Blair Witch Project by 7 years. Its premise of an investigative crew entering a haunted location utilizing modern technology birthed the modern reality television ghost hunting boom in the paranormal activity film franchise. But beyond its influence, it's a reminder of a time when we believed what we saw on our television screens. In our time of deep fakes and constant misinformation, the warning of Ghostwatch is more applicable than ever. We have to question everything we see on the screen. But for those who sat in the dark on Halloween night in 1992, the true horror of the broadcast isn't just media theory. The true horror was the lingering paranoia that somewhere in the background of the static, hidden just behind the curtains, Pipes is still standing there, silently waiting for you to look closer. Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. If you'd like to support the channel, you could become a member of the channel. I appreciate you considering this, and I do appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.